So along the chromosome lines, I want to go back to this picture. Remember how here we have this forest, and all of a sudden a new species appears? It's different from the old. And there's been no separation. There's been no geographic isolation. So how did this new species just form all of a sudden? One way it's common to form a new species is by mistakes in the chromosome numbers. Now, aneuploidy is a word that means too many chromosomes or too few chromosomes. Can you say aneuploidy?
Aneuploidy.
It's fun to say, isn't it? Aneuploidy. Here's what happens. So in meiosis, the chromosomes pair up. Let's do some independent assortment. You want to? And then they separate, go to opposite sides. Y'all remember this?
Mm-hmm.
That's meiosis I. And then, on each side, you separate the pairs. This is called meiosis II. And they separate like this, and you end up with 4 cells. Now, do you remember this process where maybe these don't separate, and they both go to one side? Y'all remember that? This sperm ends up having an extra chromosome. This one ends up having one less. That's what they're showing right here. Here's the original cell. This is how it's supposed to, there are 2 sets of chromosomes here, so this sperm cell gets 2 chromosomes. That's the correct way of separating it. This one, there's an extra chromosome. That's why it says N+1. That's the extra chromosome. That would be like this cell down here. And here, this one has 1 less. That would be like this cell here. We call that aneuploidy. Now, there's something different called polyploidy. Let's see polyploidy. Now let's go back. Okay, let's go back to here. Watch how polyploidy arises. Okay, here's, we're forming normal sperm and egg cells. Watch this. Separate, separate, separate. We're all good over here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Watch this. What if we did this?
Not good.
Could be a problem.
This agar sperm gets everything, and this one gets nothing. That actually happens. And it's basically whatever, the spindle fibers or whatever didn't form right, and they didn't pull any of the chromosomes. So all the chromosomes just kind of stayed in one side, and you end up with a whole agar sperm with full sets instead of half. Instead of half, you get full sets of the agar sperm. So, if this sperm cell, which has, it's supposed to be haploid, right? Sperm cells are haploid, N. Normally a haploid sperm cell matches up with a haploid egg cell, and you get a diploid organism, right? That's how it normally works. Well, what if this sperm cell that has 2 full sets, it's 2N, hooks up with a normal egg cell that's N? What do you get?
3N.
3N. You get an organism with 3 sets of chromosomes. If that's an animal, it'll almost always die. It won't form at all. You'll have this cell, this zygote, that just dies. It's too much information. But plants can survive it. For some reason, the way plant physiology works, it doesn't kill them. And you can have a triploid plant that survives. And we call that polyploid, a polyploid individual. Now the thing about when you have 3 sets of chromosomes, the separation in meiosis is screwed up because 3 is an odd number.
That was so cool looking at pictures of polyploid plants.
Polyploid plants? Yeah, a lot of the seedless watermelon. You like seedless water? When I was a kid, you ate watermelon, you had to spit the seeds out. It was terrible. I had a terrible childhood because of it. Nowadays, you just eat the watermelon, there's hardly any seeds in it. Have you ever noticed? You grew up with that. You don't even realize it. Seedless watermelon is a polyploid plant. Because it has an odd number of chromosomes, they don't separate in meiosis, they don't make seeds. Isn't that great? Seedless watermelon. Somebody got rich off of that. If this number, the N number, let's say we had a 2N gamete and it matched up with another 2N gamete, a 2N sperm and a 2N egg match up with one another. That can often happen because the organisms, plants can self-pollinate. A lot of plants can pollinate themselves, mate with themselves, sexually reproduce with themselves. Crazy thing plants can do. And so if you were a plant, let's say that's 3N. Let's say you're this 3N plant that can grow but can't reproduce well. But if you could mate with yourself and you get 3N plus 3N, you can have 6 sets of chromosomes in the cell. And usually that'll die, but sometimes it will survive and it'll have totally different traits. A lot of the plants that we have that produce these giant fruits and vegetables and stuff, they kind of would be weird in nature, but we like them. They're polyploid. Yes?
Are identical twins 6 and then they separate or like
No, an identical twin comes from a normal zygote that just copies itself by mitosis. Normal cell division. Each of those grows into a person. So the original fertilized egg will copy itself. Scientists don't know why it does. They still have the same number, a normal number of chromosomes. Animals with too many sets of chromosomes never survive. I don't want to say never because it might have happened somehow, but virtually it doesn't work in animal physiology. But that's how you can end up with this new kind of tree that is different from the old kind of tree, and you don't have to be separated. It can just appear amongst the others. And so the book talks about this. Now, let's keep going talking about different species. When we're going along in an evolutionary tree and we have a division, here's the first species, and then now you end up with 2 species. Remember the frogs that got separated by the river I showed you yesterday?
Mm-hmm.
And so you just have your green frog, and then the river separates the 2 populations, and the green frog remains on one side of the river, but the spotted frog evolves on the other side of the river. Now, this next section talks about what keeps these species separate. Let's say the river was removed and the spotted frogs came back. Couldn't they mate with the green frogs?
No.
If they were the same species, they could mate. But if they're different species, they won't mate. And we call what keeps them separated, we call it an isolating mechanism. There are several different isolating mechanisms that keep species separate. We divide them into 3 categories: pre-mating isolating mechanisms, mating isolating mechanisms, and fertilization isolating mechanisms, also called post-zygotic isolating mechanisms. Pre-zygotic isolating mechanisms happen before the zygote. Pre-zygotic means before the zygote. Y'all know a zygote is a fertilized egg?
Mm-hmm.
Before the sperm reaches the egg, there are things that can keep these separate. One of them is called habitat isolation. If this one is separated from this one by a river, a mountain, a continent separated, these things won't mate because they just can't get to one another. We would say that's a pre-zygotic isolating mechanism because you just can't get the sperm to the egg because they're separated. The sperm never gets to the egg because these organisms are separated. Temporal isolation is isolation by time. What if the mutation caused these to mate in the fall and these to mate in the spring? What if that was the mutation? Then even if they got together, they wouldn't mate, would they? Because these are mating at a different time of the year than this. So you never form a zygote. You never get sperm to egg.
Oh, that has to do with like the sperm won't like attach to the activation sites.
Maybe the sperm would attach to the egg, but they just don't mate with one another because one group's mating in the fall and one group's mating in the spring.
Okay.
And so we've isolated them that way. We call that temporal isolation. Temporal means time. I think I had a... Look at this. Look at these frogs. The wood frog mates just before April. The leopard frog mates the first week of April. Pickerel frog mates almost in May. The green frog mates in June. The bullfrog mates almost July. They're kept separated. The species are kept separated by the time that they mate. All these frogs used to be a single species if you go back in time. It's kind of like this, probably. You have an evolutionary tree, and now there's 5 frog species where there used to be 1. The fact that they mate at different times helps keep them as separate species. Look at the frogs. Rana. If you ever see the word rana, they're talking about frogs.
If there was a mutation in one of the frogs and it like kind of like could it reverse like the adaptation?
It could. It could, but so maybe allow them to mate again. Yeah, and then they would stop being separate species.
So they can merge back.
They could. Yeah. What about behavioral isolation? Behavioral isolation is the idea that what if this frog, frogs have calls. Did you know how they croak?
Mm-hmm.
Rah, rah. What if that's the normal sound the green frog makes? Rah, rah. That's the mating sound. So the male does that and the female's like, I like that. And then there's this mutation where the spotted frog doesn't do that. The spotted frog goes, rah, 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 rah. And it's a totally different sound. So the green frogs aren't going to mate with that frog that does that weird mating call. But the spotted frogs that were born with that mating call, they have their own different call. So somehow the mutation produces different calls, and now you have your organism, your species separated by their behavior, their call, or their dance. Remember the dance of the blue-footed boobies? Y'all remember me showing you that in regular biology? You got to do the certain dance, and if one is born with a mutation where it does a different dance, and another is born with a mutation, a male's born with a mutation where it does a different dance, and a female's born with a mutation where she likes that dance, then those two are going to mate. They're going to have kids that do the dance and like the dance, and here you go. You could have a whole other species. They're separated from the previous species by their behavior. That's a behavioral isolation. Do you have any examples?
But so if like one of them like observed another frog doing their dance and like imitated it, they mate like.
They could. Often you're pre-programmed to like a certain sound or dance or something like that. They a lot of times they're just It's in their DNA.
Okay.
This is a habitat isolation. This one likes sandy soil. This one likes loamy soil. Loam is thicker and has more nutrients, so you get grass plants growing. And they're separated by their habitat here. That's a habitat isolation. Oh, here's the blue-footed booby.
Yeah.
It's a behavioral isolation. This is pretty cool. These are, have you ever, you know fireflies? Look at this firefly. Every time you see the thick is when they light up. So this one has lights. It's just kind of flick, 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 flick. But this one does flick, 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 flick. And they're kept, the different species are kept separated by the different ways they blink. The flash patterns is what it's called. So these won't mate with those because of the different flash patterns. It's funny, I noticed this in the summer. I spend a lot of time in the summer up in North Carolina. My family has a house up there. You sit on the back porch when the sun goes down and the fireflies come up. Well, my whole life I've kind of noticed, because I watch it a lot, the pattern, the flashing pattern of the fireflies. Well, about 5-6 years ago, it completely changed. It was a totally different flash pattern. They used to go like that, and now they go like up, and it's a long flash. And I looked it up, and it's a totally different species of firefly, and it switched in 1 year. And I wondered if I was the only one that noticed. I thought, does anyone know the species of firefly here somehow changed? Maybe the new one came in and outcompeted the old one. I don't know. I don't know what happened. Isn't that weird?
Mm-hmm.
This is one of my favorites, mechanical isolation. So let's go back to this picture here. Mechanical isolation is a mating isolation. So maybe the organisms have the same habitat, have the same time where they mate, have the same behaviors, but what if they're mechanically isolated from one another? These are the reproductive organs of the male damselfly. You're looking at male damselfly penises. That'll get your attention. That'll wake you up. These insert the sperm into the female. And look how different they are. If you have this appendage, and you come across a female that only accepts this appendage, you aren't going to be able to mate with her, even if you wanted to. We call that mechanical isolation, where mechanically the square, the round peg doesn't fit into the square hole. You know what I'm saying? Mechanical isolation. So that can happen. Organisms might try to mate, but it won't fit, so they don't mate. And they only can mate with the ones that fit, and it keeps the species separate. These flowers have certain shapes, and the bee pollinates this foxglove flower, but the bee is not going to be able to pollinate this trumpet creeper flower because the bee can't fit into it. It takes the long tongue of a hummingbird to get into this flower. And so the bee, since it can't get in there, is not going to be able to pollinate. The pollen, when this hummingbird is feeding, the stamens of the flower bend over and hit the hummingbird on the head and deposit the pollen bird on the hummingbird's head. And when it goes to the next flower, the pistil, the female portion, reaches over and hits the hummingbird on the head. And so it pollinates. So it could be the shape of your of the flower or this is kind of the same. It's a mechanical isolation. The shape of the flower controls what causes the pollination. Let me go back to this. So I already talked about gamete isolation. Gamete isolation is the idea that the sperm, sometimes if it's, the sperm has to have certain proteins to be able to lock onto the egg. And if those proteins don't match up, even if the organisms mate and the sperm gets to the egg, it will not fertilize it. And that can keep species separate. And that's called gamete isolation. Now, this is if you mate a horse and a donkey, you get a mule. Y'all know about this?
Mm-hmm.
The mule is sterile. Two mules cannot mate with each other and produce a baby mule. And that's because the horse and the donkey have different chromosome numbers. You can make a mule, but the mule has an odd number of chromosomes. I don't know what that number is. Maybe somebody can Google it for me. The mule has an odd number of chromosomes, so when it goes through meiosis, it doesn't produce sperms and eggs correctly because of that odd number. The division is not equal. And so it won't be able to reproduce. The mule is a sterile hybrid. And so that's an example of a post-zygotic isolating mechanism. Horses and donkeys are separate species, and they can mate with one another, and they can produce an offspring, but that offspring is sterile. So we say that these remain separate species because you have to be able to produce fertile offspring. That's a zebroid. If you mate a horse and a zebra, you get something that looks like that. And they're sterile too. That's a liger.
Yeah.
That's Napoleon Dynamite's favorite organism. Bred for magic or something like that. It's a combination between a lion and a tiger. And it's also sterile. So lions and tigers are separate species. Now, this is what you were asking about. So normally a species, when it diverges like this, the two things remain separate species. And they often get further and further apart. Like for now, a horse and a donkey might be able to mate and make a mule. But fast forward 10 million years, if you made a horse and a donkey 10 million years from now, they might not even be able to make a mule. Species tend to become more different over time because their gene pools are separate. And if they have a mutation, the mutation can be passed amongst the population, and everyone could end up with the mutation in your population. But that's not going to happen in the other population. So gene pools can get more and more diverse. That's usually what happens. We call that reinforcement, where the species get separate and they get further and further apart. And these are the hybrid offspring. You can see at first you can have hybrid offspring, but later you almost never get living hybrid offspring, and it eventually disappears. David, this is fusion when they separate and they become different species, but maybe they come back together and rejoin and become the same species. That could happen, especially if it's a habitat isolation, where they're divided because of they're on different continents or something like that. And maybe they're brought back together somehow, and they had started to become different, but then they start mating again because they're back together, and they become more the same over time. And so you start getting fewer and fewer hybrids, but then more and more hybrids, and then they're eventually just back to the same species. And here is if you're going through time and you're not really becoming, you don't keep becoming different, you kind of stay the same. We call that a stability model, where you can still make hybrids. The blue are the hybrids, will be made over long periods of time. So that all three things happen in nature for various reasons. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about is gradual speciation versus punctuated equilibrium. If you have gradual changes over time, you draw your evolutionary tree like this, where they gradually change. But it doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes changes are very fast. And you might have a kind of evolutionary tree that looks like this. The green frog, suddenly there's a mutation that produces a whole new species. And the new species appears very suddenly. Like a sudden mutation that allows you to survive and makes you better. That might happen. You might have quick evolution. Evolution doesn't have to be slow. It can be quick. And we call it, when it's quick, we call it punctuated equilibrium. For some reason, there was a mutation where this bird had a curved beak instead of a straight one. So the straight beaks live on, the curved beaks live on. And then there's another mutation here that made the beak flat. This can happen very quickly. Or it could happen slowly, where you see there's slow change from straight to curved. And slow change from long to short. If evolution happens slowly, it's gradual speciation, also known as gradualism. If evolution happens quickly, it's punctuated equilibrium. And so we see both types in nature. And you can see it in the fossil record. Gradual change producing this sort of, I don't know, what is that? Is it a starfish? And then all of a sudden in the fossil record, bam, this thing appears. That's a punctuated equilibrium. Okay, that'll be it. Finish 18. I've tried to get through all of 18. Pretty much have done that. So there could be a quiz over the rest of 18.